My name is Naomi Harvey, and my presentation topic is regarding the phenomenon of police brutality in relation to the militarization of the police. Before we begin, I want to state a general content warning for images and descriptions of police violence and of violence against protesters and Black and brown people. The summer of 2020 saw widespread social protest and outrage over the filmed recording of police killing George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man in Minneapolis who had police called on him for the alleged use of a counterfeit $20 bill in a local convenience store. Across the United States and all parts of the world, protests and demonstrations occurred over the disproportionate use of extrajudicial force by cops against Black Americans and other marginalized communities. While many may believe that the death of George Floyd created a new political climate in regards to police brutality, the death of Floyd was merely a catalyst that highlighted the hundreds of extrajudicial killings of Black Americans that happened before him, such as Trayvon Martin in 2012, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and Eric Gardner in 2014, and Sandra Bland in 2015. Extrajudicial killings of Black people by the police and state is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it can be traced back to the foundations of the United States when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the shores of the Atlantic. However, the killing of George Floyd has once again brought the topic of police brutality into the political sphere. As especially noted in the recent summer 2020 protests, police were seen meeting protesters with military-grade tanks, battle shields, tear gas, arresting protesters en masse, and failing to engage in de-escalation procedures. Videos of police attacking and agitating protesters are in abundance online, and officers participating in this violence mostly go unpunished. Since the 2020 protests, we have yet to see substantial policy changes and preventative measures put in place in these communities by Democratic and Republican politicians alike. We have seen that militarized forces have begun to be involved in even the most mundane policing tasks, not just highly visible protests. Why are we seeing such a visible increase in police officers dressing like and behaving like military soldiers? Where did this all start? And assumptions that stress the use of force and threat of violence as the most appropriate and effective means to solve problems. In turn, militarization refers to the process whereby civilian police increasingly draw from and pattern themselves around the tenets of militarism and the military model. A crucial aspect of the theory of militarization in relation to modern American policing is the idea of imperial feedback. Originally described as a type of boomerang effect, imperial feedback refers to how foreign intervention, overseas imperial endeavors, or colonial rule, in turn, returns to impact metropoles, otherwise known as the parent state of a colony, in transformative ways. As quoted by French philosopher Michel Foucault, colonization, with its techniques and its political and judicial weapons, obviously transported European models to other continents. It also had a considerable boomerang effect on the mechanisms of power in the West and on the apparatuses, institutions, and techniques of power. A whole series of colonial models was brought back to the West. In layman's terms, aspects of America's imperialist military regime used by soldiers in other countries to limit counterinsurgency will always return home to affect counterinsurgent policy and policing of individuals in the parent state, in this example, the United States. For us to examine how imperial feedback and militarization affect American policing, we must examine the history of modern policing and the important changes that happened to it in the 20th century. Historically, in most Western countries, the police emerged to serve as an alternative to the military. In the United States, police are modeled on the historical concept of the local civilian or state civilian model of policing. Contemporary American police units have mainly been inspired by the London Metropolitan Police, which, shown on the left, established in 1829, wanted to serve as an alternative to what they described as a tyrannical standing army. The London police were created to be under the jurisdiction of civilian officials and appear to be non-militaristic. Police officers wore uniforms that were designed to be distinct from military uniforms. The officers did not carry firearms, and their truncheons, otherwise known as a police nightstick, were meant to be hidden from view. So, if initial American police departments were modeled on this concept, what the hell happened? The 20th century served as a major reform era for American policies, including policing. Police departments became more centralized, professionalized, and increased their capacities with the help of various new technologies and organizational tactics. Policing in this era shifted from regulating social order to actively attempting to suppress crime, what most folks recognize as modern policing today. Imperial feedback occurs in this era as well, as police reformers sought to transform their police departments in the early 20th century. One of the institutions from which they drew their inspiration was the new imperial military regime itself. Reformers drew on the organizational and cultural aspects of America's new military power and imperial regime that were used to enforce counterinsurgent policies in American colonies. Racial analyzation followed, as politicians, political elites, and the upper and middle class began to view minority populations at home with the same racialized terms they did as colonized people. Urban minorities were seen as being threats to the social and moral order and seen as unfit for self-governance, denying them voting privileges and other rights. Exaggerated fears of crime, degeneracy, and moral decay, in combination with popular racial pseudoscience that was based in eugenics, led many police reformers to intervene in the same way the American Imperial regime did, with programs and policies meant to civilize and uplift, or with disproportionate attempts to regulate vices such as alcohol and opium. A major emergence in American police militarization came in the end of the 20th century with the creation of the SWAT team units in the 1960s. SWAT teams, or Special Weapons and Attack Teams, were heavily militarized police units that initially emerged in the Los Angeles area in the late 60s. One of the founders of the LA SWAT team, John Nelson, was a former veteran of America's counterinsurgency campaigns in Vietnam. Him and other SWAT team founders sought out new organizational and tactical forms to respond to the infamous ghetto riots of Watts, Detroit, and Newark. In addition to making analogies between the African American riots and anti-colonial rebellions in Vietnam and British Africa, they turned to the military for ideas about how to manage such threats, thus creating the Special Weapons and Attack Team, which was later changed to Special Weapons and Tactics to separate the unit from its militaristic origins. Many consider the era of the war on drugs throughout the 80s and the 90s as one of the major influences on our current policing crisis. The war on drugs, spearheaded by the Reagan administration, emphasized the goal of reducing domestic street-level drug activity by creating a federal drug task force, implementing police drug raids, and overall fostering of a culture that encouraged the demonization of drug users and drug usage. This led to drastic racial disparities in drug arrests and the beginning establishments of the mass incarceration phenomenon we are all familiar with today. What is less widely known is the 1033 program, the government policy that was signed into law by the Clinton administration, known as H.R. 3230, that included the bill that allowed for the Secretary of Defense to sell or transfer excess military equipment to local law enforcement agencies. Initially enacted as part of the 1989 National Defense Authorization Act, it authorized the transfer of equipment that were suitable for use by such agencies in counter-drug activities. Congress then made the program permanent in 1996 and expanded the program's scope to require that preference be given to transfers made for the purpose of counter-drug and counter-terrorism activities. The program only distributed about $130 million worth of equipment between 1997 and 2009. However, the withdrawal of American troops from Iraq and Afghanistan in 2009 led to a boom in the number of weapons distributed. Between 2010 and 2014, it was analyzed that the 1030 program distributed an average of $226 million worth of military equipment to local law enforcement agencies each year. Now that we've established the theories of militarization and their relation to the history of policing in the United States, we can discuss how police militarization has increased rates of police brutality overall and made policing more dangerous for police officers and citizens alike. It has been argued by many scholars that increasing law enforcement agencies' access to military equipment will lead to higher levels of combined law enforcement violence. This effect occurs because the increased equipment leads to a culture of militarization that is noted over 4 dimensions: material, cultural, organizational, and operational. As militarization becomes more part of the culture, law enforcement agencies rely more on violence to solve problems. This mechanism mirrors Maslow's psychological law of the instrument theory, which thereby access to a certain tool increases the probability that the tool is used for problems when other tools may be more appropriate, including access to weapons increasing violent responses. However, militarization also means that police officers are involved in more aggressive and dangerous operations that ultimately lead to higher, not lower, risks for law enforcement agents. Evidence provided by the ACLU in 2014 showed that after a police department militarizes, it increases the number of SWAT team operations, which are deployed in circumstances deemed as high risk and exceeding the capabilities of traditional law enforcement. This also follows the logic of Maslow's law of instrument theory. Additionally, police officers may take more dangerous action if they feel safer while using military equipment. In addition to this, those committing crimes may react to police militarization similarly by being more aggressive or acquiring high-powered weapons to retaliate. Ultimately, militarization subsequently decreases police safety. Estimates imply that since 2010, militarization has increased the assault rate by 15.9% and the injury rate by 12.8%. Therefore, on average, each year, 12,440 assaults and 2,653 injuries are the results of militarization of the police. In 2015, the Washington Post began to log every fatal shooting by an on-duty police officer in the United States. Since then, there have been more than 5,000 such shootings recorded by the Post, and as of December 2, 2021, there have been 934 people shot and killed by the police in the past year. The subsequent trend of increased police militarization from the last half of the 20th century has undeniably increased how violent police behavior has become. Since the establishment of the Black Lives Matter social movement in 2013, not a single piece of substantial legislation has been passed federally to help mitigate excessive use of force and misconduct by police officers. So what is the solution? Despite the knee-jerk reaction of both liberal and conservative politicians, increasing already bloated police budgets is not going to help reduce rates of police brutality. Baltimore, Maryland, for example, has the highest per capita police budget of any American city, with a $530 million budget for 2021, but only a reported 40% homicide case clearance rate as of 2020. Since the summer 2020 protests, many have called for the defunding of inflated police budgets, removing of military-grade weapons from local law enforcement agencies, and the reallocation of those funds towards social services, education, mental health care, public housing, public health care, and many other social safety nets that help reduce crime rates. However, simply removing police funding won't address the cultural problems of contemporary policing. Modern American police often interact with the public with a warrior mindset, where they see themselves like soldiers fighting crime amidst a violent war zone, when in actuality, they are the forces that are authorized to and have jurisdiction to commit violent acts against citizens and their communities. This mindset often results in negative interactions between police and the communities they are. Many scholars argue that the embracing of a guardian mindset towards policing rather than a warrior mindset would increase police legitimacy and build community trust. Unlike the warrior mindset, the guardian mindset of policing is to work and engage with the community in non-enforcement conversations and assist in solving problems in the community. In combination with implementing aspects of restorative justice policies, a community model of policing could begin to help mend the deeply fractured relationship between police and the communities that they serve.